So Steve, I've had a lot of clients and investors across the country that have come to me and they've wanted to know about their FICO scores. They've pulled things off the internet. It doesn't match what my report says.
Well, that's what we were discussing earlier, is that we've learned that there are 3 credit scores that do count: the FICO score, the Beacon score, and the Empirica score. There's many more scores out there, and I alluded to the one called the Vantage score. There's another score out there called a Credit Expert score, spelled with an X, not EX, Credit Expert score. There's all kinds of other scores. In fact, if you watch the commercials and you watch some of the major bureaus put on commercials to get your score, that's not always a FICO score either. That's generated from Experian or from TransUnion or from Equifax. So when people say there's scores, we refer to them as a FACO score and a FICO score.
Got it.
And it's not that they're not important, it's just that as a mortgage lender, what if I brought you a score I pulled off the internet just because would it help you in getting me a loan at all as an investor?
No, I can't even use that report.
Yeah.
I have to pull my own.
Yeah, and it has to be one of the 3.
And I've actually had to I've pulled a credit report after they've pulled something offline, and mine is so totally different, and they didn't qualify for the loan.
Yeah, yeah. And it's very confusing because they make money. People make money selling these scores. And what takes place is the fact that those scores don't mean anything. And we call them a placebo. And it might be a ballpark figure, but it's not. If you're off by, have you ever had a loan fall apart because it's off by 5 points, 10 points? So
1 point?
1 point?
Yeah.
So you need to get the real scores.
Right.
There's only a few places to get the FICO score. That's either from MyFICO, you can get the real score, that's www.myfico.com, or from a lender. Now they're making it accessible to other places to get scores. But currently, the best way is through a lender. And if you're an investor, you need to have a favorite lender that you deal with. You need to have somebody that you trust that you're going to do your loans through and you're investing. And that's the person that you rely on those scores.
Right. And my investors call me, and I pull credit for them all the time.
Yeah, because
to maintain.
Exactly. And having a high score does not mean you're going to have a good score 2 weeks from now.
Right.
Or 3 weeks from now.
Correct.
So over a period of time, your investors use their scores as their, I often am referred to as a sports medicine doctor. I keep people on the playing field as investors to purchase properties and to take advantage of those opportunities that come up, because their scores are dynamic. And that's the key word, is dynamic, and they change all the time. And we're fighting the score, but we're also fighting identity theft. We're fighting all kinds of elements out there that can influence our scores.
Yeah, that's a good point there.
So maintaining and monitoring your scores is very important. So I can't advocate enough for an investor to have a good relationship with somebody they're investing with, so to keep an eye on the right score, not the FACO score, but the correct score.
Good. Well, thank you for that information. That helps. Steve, how can we raise our credit scores?
Well, raising credit scores is something that everyone needs to do, whether you're an investor or not. Investors should be actively involved in raising their scores.
Correct.
There's 24 characteristics out of a possible 300 that affect your credit score. They break that down to a scorecard. There's 10 scorecards. Now, this is the old model that they use to calculate credit scores. What a person has to understand is make sure they have the correct scores, which we talked about.
Right.
Then they need to go through their credit report and look at everything very closely. There's something that some people miss, and it's called utilization. Now, that's a term used in the industry that only really is used by Fair Isaac. Because what it does is it means that any time, I'll define what it means, is it's the default system to protect the bank and merchants in the event that your current balance has not been reported or updated.
Okay.
Which means that it reverts back to the most current, highest balance you ever had on a credit card.
Okay,
go on.
So if they didn't report, then it's going to go back to what it was before.
Worse than that. It'll go to the highest
worse.
balance that it ever was on the history of the card.
That is bad.
It is. And that's why you look at a credit report really closely, and it seems as though nothing's changed and the score's gone down. So we use the term utilization. And it's a default program that they built in there to protect the banks. So the next time you have an investor and he expects to have a good score. In fact, he may have even paid off his balances below 50%, and his score has dropped. For some reason, there was a breakdown of that information getting reported correctly and in time, which the default system utilization kicked in. And it may only last for a couple of weeks, but it might be very imperative that they look at it very closely, because that door of opportunity is going to shut for that investor to purchase what he has to.
Correct.
So teach your people to look at the balances that they currently have on those cards. That's very important.
Okay, wonderful.
As a result of that, we've talked about it defaults to the highest. So if their balance on that card, in your case, you've used a card for every month and you pay it off every month, but for some reason it doesn't reflect that you paid that balance off, then you're going to have a problem. So that's something that a lot of people don't look at, and they expect to have good credit quickly, and this might answer that dilemma that people come up with when they say, well, why is my score low and I've paid off my credit cards? There's another way too. Another way to raise credit scores is to be able to, we've talked a little bit about being an authorized user.
Right.
That works very well. That's a very effective way to raise a score fairly quickly. We've also talked about the credit history and what a person can do about that.
Well, and I have a thought on that.
Okay.
I actually had a client who was building his credit. Now, what he did incorrect in this instance was he paid off some collections that were old.
Right.
So it dropped his scores.
Right.
So then he went out and he got new credit lines. However, they were not reporting. So,
Quickly, probably.
well, it had been about 6 months, and
Okay.
he'd had 2 different credit lines
Right.
with his bank
Okay.
in Las Vegas.
Right.
And he was purchasing a mortgage, or a home, and he needed a mortgage, and his credit scores were really low. They were low to where he was struggling getting this mortgage, and his payments were very high. So I suggested that we call his credit union and ask them to report, because those 2 new credit lines were not on the credit. And what they told me was something I'd never heard before, and that is that it takes like 6 months for a new credit line to report on the credit, even though he'd opened it 6 months ago.
Right.
It took 6 to 8 months. Is that true?
In some cases it is, but when you call to have them report, there's no promise or guarantee that they have to report to the Bureau.
Well, they said that they were reporting, though, but it wouldn't show up. I can't remember which bureau it was, but one of the bureaus would not actually
Okay.
show it up on the credit until after 6 to 8 months. Does that make more
It
sense?
does. See, the credit bureau makes money from merchants, and the bureau makes money from merchants paying them to have the privilege of reporting. Credit unions by nature are very small, and some in Utah are very big. But for the most part, nationwide they're small, and they report to one bureau, maybe 2.
Right.
However, in your case, you want that information reported to all 3 in order
Right.
to raise the score. That is a common problem that happens a lot. In fact, there's also a company that is willing to report your rental payments on
Right.
time, being paid on time.
Now, who's that? I mean, because
Well,
we can get it
there's-
added to the bureaus, but it doesn't really give you a score.
Yeah, you can add it to the bureau, but over time what happens is they're trying to make it so that it's called an expansion score. And it's something brand new that the bureaus are putting out there so that they can give you credit for every possible transaction they can, so that you do get credit for paying off other institutions that may not be members of the bureau
Okay.
as a renter. So when you say, how do you raise the score for your investors? First one is to understand that you have the correct score. Second is to review what you currently have. And remember, we broke everything down into 5 factors.
Right.
Look at the history. Make sure that the history, now you brought up something important too. A lot of people look at the history and they say that they've paid off a collection account.
Right.
Or we've talked about that. They paid it off a couple years later. There's nothing wrong with trying to negotiate with that collection agency to be able to say, if I make this payment to you, would you be willing to delete it from my credit report? Now, there's lots of precedents set that that's completely acceptable and legal.
And
they're
so
getting-
if they get it in writing and they
get
don't
it-
take it off, they can actually send that into the bureau?
They can't send it to the bureau, but generally the council, that letter doesn't just come from the minimum wage employee you're talking to. It usually comes from someone else. And so what you want to do is negotiate. The term here is everything's negotiable. And you do not want it, now they'll play games sometimes, and they'll say,
Right.
we'll put on there that it's a 0 balance. We'll put on there that it's paid. You want a letter to negotiate with them that they'll take it completely off the report if that's paid.
And what if they don't? That's the big question, if
Well,
they don't.
On your check that you send to them, it's called a conditional endorsement. On the back of the check, there's certain wording that I'd be willing to share with you, so it's kind of lengthy, that would require them to do that. I've never encountered them not backtracking or backpedaling. It's the timing. If you put on their time is of the essence. It's how long it takes them to do that. And you'll encounter people saying you can't do that. You'll say illegal, I can't. Everything's negotiable. So if you're going to pay off old debts, with an exception, judgments. You cannot really negotiate judgments. That's a court transaction.
Right.
So you can get it possibly dismissed, but those are a lot more lengthy steps you got to do to get that off the report if you're willing to pay it.
That makes more sense. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Steve, I appreciate you going over the credit history with me and the credit scores and all of that. Could you just do a quick review?
Yes, I'd love to. Credit scores are the most important factors for us to follow as consumers and especially as investors.
Okay.
We've discussed a little bit of the history, but mainly accessing our scores and getting the correct scores, and then understanding those scores and not feeling like you're alone because they're confusing or you don't understand them. Nobody's alone in that. Hopefully we went over the 5 factors that influence a score. We went over exactly how much control you may have on that score and what you can do. I'm sure all of us will agree how important those scores are. An investor only has to buy a few properties to realize how important it really is. So once you get your score and you go over the 5 factors, then you can understand what you can do to raise that score. And we've talked about a few scenarios of what you can do individually to make sure that score is as high as it can possibly be. And there's some pitfalls in that score too. There's one thing I didn't share that's really important on the scores that I think would be a little bit of a tidbit of information too. Not all the banks that you do business with report all your good credit. So when you're looking at a credit report, mostly people might look at just the negative on there. You want to look at the good credit too and make sure that all that's being reported as possible as it could possibly be.
That is a good point.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing all that with us.
Thank you.